Millionaire cared for his paralyzed son for 20 years, until one day, suspecting something, he decided to install cameras at home. What he saw in the recordings left him in shock. The sun filtered through the silk curtains, drawing golden patterns on the marble floor of the room. Alexander Morgan, a 55-year-old businessman, silently observed the city sprawling beneath his feet from the window of his penthouse on the 40th floor. His gaze, normally sharp and penetrating, seemed lost on the horizon. As if searching for answers in the distance, the sound of the door opening snapped him out of his thoughts. Without turning, he immediately knew who it was. "Good morning, Mr. Morgan," said a female voice. "I'm bringing you the reports you requested yesterday." Alexander turned slowly, his face a mask of serenity that hid the inner storm consuming him. "Thank you, Sarah," he replied in a deep voice. "Please leave them on the desk." Sarah Parker, his personal assistant for over a decade, nodded professionally. At 40, she was an elegant and discreet woman, perfect for her position. She placed the documents on the mahogany desk and was about to leave, but Alexander's voice stopped her. "Sarah, how is Samuel today?" The question, seemingly casual, made Sarah imperceptibly tense. "Young Samuel is fine, sir. The physiotherapist arrived half an hour ago for his morning session." Alexander nodded, his gaze returning to the window. "Thank you, Sarah, that will be all for now." When the door closed behind his assistant, Alexander let out a long, tired sigh. He approached his desk and picked up a silver-framed photograph. In it, a younger Alexander smiled, next to a bright-eyed teenager with a mischievous grin. Samuel, his son, before the accident that changed their lives, forever. The memory of that fateful night, 10 years ago, still haunted him. The screeching of tires, the sound of twisting metal, the screams, and then the silence. A silence that seemed to have lasted an eternity until the paramedics arrived. Alexander closed his eyes, trying to push those images from his mind. When he opened them, his gaze had hardened. With determination, he turned on his computer and accessed a special program. Several windows appeared on the screen, each showing different areas of the Morgan mansion. His eyes focused on one in particular. Samuel's room. There, his 25-year-old son was sitting in his wheelchair, while the physiotherapist, a young woman named Lucy, worked on his legs. Alexander observed the scene with a mixture of love and suspicion. Something didn't fit. Small details he had noticed in recent weeks troubled him. The way Samuel moved, when he thought no one was watching, certain involuntary gestures. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he said, quickly closing the surveillance windows. It was Richard Foster, his right-hand man in the company. "Mr. Morgan, the board of directors is waiting. We need to discuss the merger with Global Corporation." Alexander nodded, standing up. "Of course, let's go." As he followed Richard to the boardroom, Alexander couldn't stop thinking about Samuel. Was he being paranoid? Or was his son really hiding something from him? The meeting dragged on for hours. Alexander, normally the epitome of concentration, found himself struggling to keep his mind on the numbers and strategies being discussed. His thoughts kept returning to Samuel's room, to those small moments he had caught on the cameras. When the meeting finally ended, Alexander hurried back to his office. He locked the door and reopened the surveillance program. He spent the next few hours reviewing recordings from previous days, looking for something, anything that could confirm or deny his suspicions, and then he saw it. It was a recording from 3 days ago. Close to midnight, Samuel was alone in his room. He looked around as if making sure no one was watching him, and then, slowly, with evident effort, but without any help, he stood up from the wheelchair. Alexander held his breath. His son took 2 shaky steps before sitting back down. Exhausted but with a triumphant smile on his face, Alexander's hands were shaking when he paused the video. A mix of emotions overwhelmed him. Joy at seeing his son standing, anger at the deception, confusion about how to proceed. The sound of his phone snapped him out of his trance. It was Sarah. "Mr. Morgan, Dr. Ramirez is here for your monthly checkup." Alexander had completely forgotten about his medical appointment. "Thank you, Sarah, tell him to come in." Minutes later, Dr. Ramirez, a man in his 60s with grey hair and thick-rimmed glasses, entered the office. "Alexander, how have you been feeling?" the doctor asked as he prepared his equipment. "Fine, as always," Alexander replied distractedly. His mind still on the video he had just seen. Dr. Ramirez examined him thoroughly, asking routine questions and taking notes. When he finished, his expression turned serious. "Alexander, there's something that concerns me. Your latest blood tests show some anomalies. I want to do more tests to be sure, but what, doctor?" Alexander asked, feeling a sudden tightness in his chest. "It could be nothing, but it could also be something serious. I'd rather not get ahead of myself until I have all the results. I'll send you for some specialized studies tomorrow itself." Alexander nodded mechanically, dismissing the doctor with a handshake. When he was alone, he collapsed into his chair, overwhelmed. In a matter of hours, his world seemed to have turned upside down. The rest of the day passed in a haze. Alexander cancelled his remaining commitments and retired early to the mansion. During dinner, he observed Samuel with new eyes, looking for signs, any indication that would confirm what he had seen in the video. Samuel, for his part, acted normally, complaining about the low-salt food they served him, on medical recommendation, and talking enthusiastically about a new series he was watching. "Dad, are you okay?" Samuel asked at one point, noticing his father's distraction. "You look pale." Alexander forced a smile. "I'm fine, son, just a bit tired from work." That night, Alexander couldn't sleep. He tossed and turned in his bed, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. On one hand, there was the joy of knowing his son could walk, even if just a little. On the other, the anguish of not knowing why Samuel was hiding something so important from him. And above all that, the shadow of worry about his own health. The next morning, Alexander got up early and headed to the hospital for the studies Dr. Ramirez had ordered. While waiting for the results, he couldn't help but think about the empire he had built, about Samuel, about everything he could lose if the news was bad. When he returned to the office, he found Sarah waiting for him with a worried expression. "Mr. Morgan, Richard called. He says it's urgent that you contact him. It seems there's a problem with the merger." Alexander sighed deeply. The problems seemed to be multiplying. He locked himself in his office and called Richard. "Alexander." Richard's voice sounded tense. "Global Corporation is backing out. They say they've received a better offer from our competition." "What? How is that possible?" Alexander felt the room spinning. "This merger was crucial for the company's future. I don't know, but we need to act fast. I've called an emergency meeting for this afternoon." Alexander hung up the phone, feeling overwhelmed. At that moment, his gaze fell on Samuel's photograph. An idea began to form in his mind. If his son could walk, even if just a little, maybe it was time for him to take on some responsibilities in the company. With determination, he called Sarah. "Sarah, please tell Samuel I want to see him in my office this afternoon. It's important." The hours passed slowly. Alexander alternated between preparing for the emergency meeting and thinking about how to approach the conversation with Samuel. When the time finally came, he heard the familiar sound of the wheelchair approaching down the hallway. Samuel entered the office, his face a mixture of curiosity and slight concern. "Dad, what's going on?" Sarah said it was important. Alexander looked at his son, hesitating for a moment. Should he confront him directly, or give him the opportunity to confess on his own? "Samuel," he began, opting for an indirect approach, "I've been thinking, you've been away from the company for a long time. I think it's time for you to get more involved." The surprise on Samuel's face was evident. "Me? But Dad, you know I can't. My condition." "Your condition doesn't have to be an impediment," Alexander interrupted, closely observing his son's reaction. "There are many things you could do from home to start with. And later on, maybe you could come to the office occasionally." Samuel seemed uncomfortable, his hands nervously fiddling with the controls of his wheelchair. "I don't know, Dad. I don't think I'm ready for that." Alexander felt frustration growing inside him. Why did his son insist on maintaining this farce? He was about to confront him directly when his phone rang. It was Dr. Ramirez. "Excuse me for a moment, Samuel," he said, moving away to answer the call. The doctor's voice sounded grave. "Alexander, I have the results of your exams. I'm afraid I need you to come to my office as soon as possible. It's important." Alexander felt a chill run down his spine. "I understand, doctor. I'll be there in an hour." When he hung up, he found Samuel looking at him worriedly. "Everything okay, Dad?" For a moment, Alexander considered telling his son everything, about his suspicions, about his health, but something held him back. "Yes, everything's fine, just a routine checkup." Samuel didn't seem convinced, but he didn't insist. "Do you want us to keep talking about the company?" Alexander shook his head. "No, we'll leave that for another time. I have to leave now." As he watched Samuel leave the office in his wheelchair, Alexander felt a pang of pain. How had they come to this point? At what moment had the trust between father and son been broken in this way? With a sigh, Alexander prepared to go to Dr. Ramirez's office, aware that the revelations of that day could change his life forever. The journey to Dr. Ramirez's clinic was a blur of streets and buildings for Alexander. His mind was divided between worry about his health and frustration over the situation with Samuel. When he finally arrived and sat down in front of the doctor's desk, he felt as if he had run a marathon. "Alexander," Dr. Ramirez began, his voice soft but serious, "the results of your tests have revealed something concerning you have a rare disease called Erdheim-Chester syndrome." Alexander blinked, confused. "I've never heard of that disease. What does that mean, doctor?" The doctor took off his glasses and cleaned them slowly, as if looking for the right words. "It's a condition that affects multiple organs and systems in the body. In your case, it seems to be primarily affecting your bones and cardiovascular system." "And the treatment?" Alexander asked, feeling a lump in his throat. Dr. Ramirez sighed. "There are treatments that can help manage the symptoms and slow the progression of the disease. But Alexander, I must be honest with you, in your case the diagnosis is late. The disease is quite advanced." Alexander felt as if the ground was opening beneath his feet. "How long?" he asked hoarsely. The doctor looked at him with compassion. "With aggressive treatment, we could be talking about 1 to 2 years. Without treatment, maybe 6 months." The world seemed to stop for Alexander. 6 months, a year. 2 at most. Suddenly, everything he had built, everything he had fought for seemed insignificant. "I understand this is a very hard blow," Dr. Ramirez continued, "but it's important that we start treatment as soon as possible. I also recommend that you put your affairs in order," and the rest of the conversation passed in a haze for Alexander. He left the clinic feeling like a different man than the one who had entered. The sun was shining in the sky, people were walking on the streets, busy with their daily lives. How could the world keep turning when his had just stopped? As he drove back to the office, 1,000 thoughts crossed his mind. His company, his legacy, Samuel. The idea of his son walking in secret while he faced a death sentence provoked a mixture of emotions he couldn't decipher. Upon arriving at the company, he ignored the worried looks from his employees and locked himself in his office. Sarah tried to speak to him, but he dismissed her with a brusque gesture. Alone in his sanctuary of glass and steel, Alexander allowed himself to break down. The tears he had held back for so long finally flowed freely. He cried for the life he wouldn't live, for the moments he wouldn't share, for the future that would be taken from him. When he finally managed to calm down, his gaze fell on Samuel's photograph. Anger began to replace sadness. How could his son deceive him like this? Didn't he realize how much he had sacrificed? With trembling hands, Alexander opened his computer and accessed the surveillance system again. He spent the next few hours observing Samuel, looking for more evidence of his deception. He saw him interact with the physiotherapist, feigning difficulties he clearly didn't have. He saw him move cautiously when he thought no one was watching. Each image, each movement fueled Alexander's fury. As he watched, a plan began to form in his mind. If he had little time left, he would make sure his legacy didn't fall into the hands of someone who didn't deserve it. The sound of his phone snapped him out of his dark thoughts. It was Richard. "Alexander, where are you?" "The board of directors is waiting. We need to make a decision about the merger. Alexander looked at the clock. He had lost track of time. I'm on my way, he replied curtly, hanging up without waiting for a response. Before leaving, he took one last look at the screen. Samuel was in the garden laughing with one of the gardeners. The image of his son, apparently carefree while he dealt with a death sentence, was the last straw. Enjoy it while you can, Alexander muttered. Things are about to change. With that silent promise, Alexander headed to the boardroom. As he walked, his mind worked at full speed. The merger, his illness, Samuel's deception, everything intertwined in a complex tapestry of decisions and consequences. As he entered the boardroom, all eyes turned to him. Richard seemed relieved to see him. "Gentlemen," Alexander began, his voice firm despite the inner turmoil. "I understand we're in a critical situation with the merger. But before we make a decision, there's something you need to know." An expectant silence filled the room. Alexander took a deep breath. "I've received personal news that will affect the future of this company. In the coming months, I'll need to reduce my involvement in daily operations." The murmurs of surprise and concern didn't take long to arise. Richard looked at him with a mixture of confusion and alarm. "Alexander, what's going on?" he asked quietly. Ignoring the question, Alexander continued. "This is why I propose an immediate restructuring, Richard," he said, turning to his right-hand man. "From now on, you'll take a more prominent role in the company's direction. I trust your judgment to handle the situation with Global Corporation." The surprise on Richard's face was evident, but he nodded with determination. "Of course, Alexander. I'll do everything in my power." For the next 2 hours, Alexander watched as Richard led the discussion about the merger. His mind, however, was far from there. He thought about Samuel, about how to confront him, about what to do with the company, about how to spend his last months. When the meeting finally ended, Alexander remained alone in the room. Richard, the last to leave, paused at the door. "Alexander," he said softly, "I don't know what's going on, but if you need to talk—" Alexander looked up, meeting Richard's concerned gaze. For a moment he considered telling him everything, but something held him back. "Thank you, Richard. Maybe another time." When he was alone, Alexander took out his phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in years. "Hello?" A female voice answered on the other end of the line. "Emily," Alexander said, his voice barely a whisper. "I need to see you." There was a long silence before Emily responded. "After all these years? Alexander, what's going on?" "Please." Alexander's voice broke slightly. "It's important." Another silence. Finally, Emily sighed. "All right. Where shall we meet?" They agreed to meet at a small cafe on the outskirts of the city, a place where they used to gather years ago, when their relationship was a secret they both guarded closely. Alexander arrived first. Sitting at a secluded table, he watched the door nervously. When Emily entered, he felt as if time was going backward. Despite the years, she was still the same elegant woman with an intense gaze that had captivated him so long ago. "Alexander," Emily said, sitting across from him. "It's been a long time." He nodded, unable to find the right words. How could he explain everything that was happening? "Emily," he finally began, "I know our history is complicated, but I need your help." Emily looked at him with a mixture of curiosity and concern. "What's going on, Alexander? You look different." Alexander took a deep breath and began to speak. He told her about his illness, about Samuel and his suspicions, about his fears for the future of the company. The words flowed like an overflowing river, releasing everything he had kept bottled up for so long. Emily listened in silence, her expression changing from surprise to concern, and finally to determination. "Alexander," she said when he finally finished speaking, "what you're asking me is—" "I know," he interrupted. "I know it's a lot to ask after all this time, but you're the only person I can trust for this." Emily was silent for a moment, as if weighing her options. Finally, she nodded slowly. "All right, Alexander, I'll help you. But I need you to understand something. I'm doing this for you, not for Samuel. and certainly not for the company. Alexander felt a weight lift from his shoulders. "Thank you, Emily. You don't know what this means to me." As they discussed the details of his plan, Alexander couldn't help but think about how they had reached this point. Emily, the woman who had once been the love of his life, would now become a key piece in the future of his legacy. That night, back at the mansion, Alexander found himself in front of Samuel's room door. He could hear the sound of the television on the other side. For a moment, he considered entering and confronting his son right there. But something held him back. It wasn't the time. Not yet. He retreated to his study, where he spent the next few hours reviewing legal and financial documents. When he finally went to bed, it was almost dawn. In his dreams, Alexander saw himself standing on the edge of a cliff. On one side was Samuel, smiling and walking freely. On the other, Emily looked at him with a mixture of love and sadness, and in front of him, a dark and deep abyss that seemed to be calling him. He woke up startled, drenched in cold sweat. The clock showed 3 a.m. With a sigh, Alexander got up and went to the window. The city slept under a blanket of dim lights, oblivious to the drama unfolding in the Morgan mansion. "Soon," Alexander murmured, looking towards the horizon. "Soon everything will change." Dawn found him still awake, his mind a whirlwind of plans and decisions. The day ahead promised to be one that would change the course of many lives. And Alexander Morgan was determined to face it with all the strength he had left. The sun was barely peeking over the horizon when Alexander Morgan was already in his office. The dark circles under his eyes were testimony to another sleepless night, but his gaze reflected an unshakable determination. On his desk, a stack of legal documents awaited his attention. The sound of footsteps approaching snapped him. Out of his thoughts, it was Sarah, his faithful assistant, with a cup of coffee in her hand. "Good morning, Mr. Morgan," she said, placing the cup in front of him. "I didn't expect to find you so early." Alexander managed a tired smile. "There's a lot to do, Sarah. Could you ask Richard to come to my office as soon as he arrives?" Sarah nodded, but before leaving, she paused. "Sir, is everything all right? Lately, I've noticed you seem different." For a moment, Alexander considered telling her the truth. After all, Sarah had been more than just a simple assistant all these years, but the memory of Samuel's betrayal hardened his heart. "Everything's fine, Sarah. It's just changes in the company. Nothing to worry about." When Sarah left, Alexander turned his attention to the documents. Among them, one stood out, his will. With trembling hands, he began to make modifications, crossing out Samuel's name in several sections. As he worked, his mind traveled to the past, to the first days after Samuel's accident. He remembered the sleepless nights at the hospital, the anguish of not knowing if his son would ever walk again, the promises he made to himself that he would do everything possible to ensure Samuel had the best life possible. "How did we come to this, son?" he murmured to himself, a solitary tear rolling down his cheek. The sound of the door opening snapped him out of his memories. It was Richard. "Alexander, Sarah said you wanted to see me," he said, entering the office. Alexander quickly composed himself. "Yes, Richard. Please, sit down. We have a lot to discuss." Over the next hour, Alexander explained to Richard his plans for restructuring the company. He talked about new responsibilities, changes in the board of directors, long-term strategies. What he didn't tell him was the reason for these sudden changes. Richard listened attentively, nodding and asking occasional questions, but Alexander could see the concern in his eyes. "Alexander," Richard finally said, "I appreciate the trust you're placing in me, but I can't help but think there's something more behind all this. Are you sure there's nothing you want to tell me?" Alexander got up and approached the window, turning his back to Richard. "There are things, Richard, that it's better not to know. For now, trust me, everything I'm doing is for the good of the company." Richard nodded slowly. "I understand you know you can count on me for whatever you need." When Richard left the office, Alexander allowed himself a moment of weakness. He sat heavily in his chair, the weight of his secrets crushing him. But there was no time for lamentations. He had a pending meeting that could change everything. That afternoon, Alexander found himself again in the small cafe on the outskirts of the city. Emily was already there, elegant as always, with a folder on the table. "Did you get it?" Alexander asked without preamble. Emily nodded, sliding the folder towards him. "It wasn't easy, but here's everything: medical records, bills, even some photographs. If what you suspect is true, this will prove it." Alexander opened the folder with trembling hands. As he reviewed the documents, his face went from disbelief to anger, and finally to deep sadness. "I can't believe it," he murmured, "all this time." Emily watched him in silence, her expression a mixture of compassion and something else, something Alexander couldn't decipher. "What are you going to do now?" she finally asked. Alexander closed the folder with a sharp thud. "What?" "I should have done a long time ago, face the truth." That night, back at the mansion, Alexander went straight to Samuel's room. Without bothering to knock, he flung the door open. Samuel, who was sitting in his wheelchair in front of the TV, visibly startled. "Dad, what?" "The game is over, Samuel," Alexander interrupted, his voice shaking with contained emotion. He threw the folder onto the bed. "I know everything." The color drained from Samuel's face. For a moment, it seemed he was going to deny everything, but something in his father's gaze stopped him. "Dad, I can't explain," he began, his voice barely a whisper. "Explain what?" Alexander exploded. "How you've been lying to me for years. How you've been wasting your life pretending a disability you no longer have." Samuel lowered his gaze, unable to face his father. "It's not that simple." "Not that simple?" Alexander laughed bitterly. "Tell me, son, what part isn't simple? The part where you recovered years ago and decided not to tell me? Or the part where you've been spending the money I earned with so much effort on therapies you no longer need?" Tears began to roll down Samuel's cheeks. "I'm sorry, Dad. I was afraid of facing the world, afraid of not living up to your expectations." Alexander felt his heart breaking in, too. He wanted to hug his son, tell him everything would be okay. But the memory of his own illness, of the few months he had left, hardened his resolve. "Samuel," he said, his voice now cold and distant, "from tomorrow on, things are going to change. There will be no more therapies, no more nurses, no more special attentions. It's time for you to face reality." "But Dad..." "There are no buts," Alexander interrupted. "You've had years to tell the truth. Now it's too late." With those words, Alexander left the room, leaving Samuel alone with his guilt and his tears. That night, as the Morgan mansion sank into a tense silence, two tormented souls struggled with their inner demons. Samuel, locked in his room, faced the reality of his actions for the first time in years. Alexander, in his study, worked feverishly on the documents that would change the future of his family and his company. Neither of them knew that, at that very moment, another person was about to enter their lives and change them forever. In a modest apartment on the other side of the city, Lucy, Samuel's young physiotherapist, stared fixedly at her phone. On the screen, a text message glowed ominously. "It's time you knew the truth about the Morgans tomorrow. 10 a.m. at the cafe in Central Park. Don't be late." Lucy didn't know it, but she was about to become a key piece in the drama unfolding at the Morgan mansion, and with her would come revelations that would shake the foundations of everything. Alexander and Samuel believed they knew. The dawn of the next day would bring with it not only a new day, but the beginning of a series of events that would change the fate of all involved. And as the city awakened, oblivious to the drama unfolding in its midst, the characters in our story prepared, unknowingly, to face their greatest challenges. In the Morgan mansion, Alexander got up early, as was his custom. But this morning, his usual routine was interrupted by an unexpected call. "Hello," he answered, his voice still hoarse from sleep. "Alexander, it's Emily. I need to see you urgently. Something has come up, something that changes everything." Emily's tone made Alexander immediately alert. "What's going on?" Does it have to do with... Not over the phone, Emily interrupted. Meet me in an hour at the usual place. Before Alexander could respond, Emily had hung up. With a sigh of frustration, he began to get dressed. What new twist did fate have in store for them? Meanwhile, in his room, Samuel looked out the window, his eyes red and swollen from a night of crying. The confrontation with his father had been devastating, but also liberating. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of the lie lifting from his shoulders. With determination, he got up from the wheelchair and took a few shaky steps. It was time to face the truth, not only with his father, but with the world. What Samuel didn't know was that his actions were about to trigger a series of events that would change the course of many lives, including his own. As the sun rose in the sky, illuminating the city, the characters in our story were heading unknowingly towards a point of convergence that would change everything. And at the center of it all, a secret that had remained hidden for years, waiting for the right moment to come to light. The cafe in Central Park bustled with activity that morning. Among the crowd of hurried office workers and mothers with strollers, Lucy waited nervously, her gaze jumping from one face to another, looking for her mysterious informant. At 10 o'clock sharp, a middle-aged man sat down across from her. Without saying a word, he handed her a manila envelope. "Everything you need to know is in there," the man said in a low voice. "Use it wisely." Before Lucy could ask questions, the man was gone, lost in the crowd. With trembling hands, she opened the envelope. What she found inside left her breathless. Meanwhile, in the small cafe on the outskirts of the city, Alexander and Emily were engrossed in an intense conversation. "Are you sure about this?" Alexander asked, his face pale. Emily nodded gravely. "Completely. The evidence is irrefutable." Alexander ran a hand over his face, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he had just discovered. "My God, how could I have been so blind?" "The question now is," Emily said, leaning forward, "what are you going to do with this information?" Alexander was silent for a moment, his mind working at full speed. Finally, with a look of determination, he said, "I'm going to do what I should have done a long time ago. I'm going to face the truth, no matter the consequences." While Alexander and Emily discussed their next steps at the Morgan mansion, Samuel had made a decision. With slow but sure steps, he went down the stairs, leaving his wheelchair behind. Sarah, who was passing through the hall, dropped the tray she was carrying when she saw him. "Young Samuel," she exclaimed, her eyes wide open. You're walking, Sarah," Samuel completed with a sad smile. "I've been walking for a long time. It's time everyone knew." At that moment, the front door burst open. Alexander entered, followed closely by Emily. Seeing Samuel standing, Alexander stopped short. "Dad," Samuel began, "there's something I need to tell you." But before he could continue, another voice interrupted. "I think we all have a lot to say," Lucy said, entering the mansion with the manila envelope in her hand. The silence that followed was deafening. At that moment, in the hall of the Morgan mansion, 5 people looked at each other, each with their own secrets, each about to face truths that would change their lives forever. And so, with the midday sun filtering through the windows, illuminating the tense and expectant faces, the most dramatic chapter in the history of the Morgan family began. Alexander was the first to break the silence. "It seems we all have something to say," he said, his voice loaded with emotion. "But before we start, there's something you all need to know." He paused, taking a deep breath. "I'm sick. I have only a few months to live." The revelation fell like a bomb in the room. Samuel took a shaky step towards his father, forgetting for a moment his own confession. "Dad, what are you saying?" Alexander looked at his son, a mixture of love and disappointment in his eyes. "I have a rare disease, Samuel. It's terminal. That's why I've been making changes in the company, in my will." "Your will?" Samuel interrupted, his voice trembling. "Dad, I don't want your money. I just want you to be okay." Alexander smiled bitterly. "It's too late for that, son. But now it's your turn. What were you going to tell me?" Samuel looked around, noticing the expectant looks of everyone. With a sigh, he straightened his shoulders. The truth is that I've been pretending I've been able to walk for years, but I was afraid to face the world, to disappoint you." The silence that followed was heavy, loaded with contained emotions. Alexander closed his eyes as if the weight of this revelation was too much to bear. It was then that Lucy stepped forward. "There's more," she said, holding the manila envelope. "Much more." All eyes turned to her. Lucy, with trembling hands, took several documents out of the envelope. These papers reveal the truth about the Morgan family, a truth that has been hidden for years. Emily, who had remained silent until now, approached Lucy. "Where did you get that?" she asked, her voice loaded with tension. "That doesn't matter now," Lucy replied. "What matters is what they contain." Turning to Alexander and Samuel, she continued, "According to these documents, you two are not father and son." The revelation fell like lightning in the room. Samuel staggered, seeking support on the nearest wall. Alexander, for his part, remained motionless, his face a mask of shock. "What are you saying?" Alexander finally managed to articulate. Lucy took a breath before continuing. "These papers show that Samuel was adopted in secret. His real mother is Emily." All eyes turned to Emily, who had visibly paled. I can explain," she began, but her voice broke. Alexander turned to her, his eyes full of pain and confusion. "Emily, is this true?" Emily nodded slowly, tears forming in her eyes. "Yes, Alexander, Samuel is my son, our son." The silence that followed was deafening. Samuel looked from Alexander to Emily and back, trying to process this new reality. But how? Why? Emily took a deep breath before beginning her story. 25 years ago, Alexander and I had a relationship. We were young, we were in love, but the circumstances. When I discovered I was pregnant, Alexander was already engaged to another woman, your adoptive mother, Samuel. Alexander intervened, his voice loaded with emotion. I didn't know Emily disappeared without saying a word. When she returned years later, she never mentioned I couldn't, Emily interrupted. By then you had already adopted Samuel. I thought it was best for everyone. Samuel, who had been listening to all this in shock, finally found his voice. So my whole life has been a lie. No, son, Alexander said, approaching him. The love I feel for you is real. It always has been. Lucy, who had been observing all this, in silence spoke again. There's more. These documents also reveal something about Morgan Enterprises. Alexander turned to her, his face a mixture of exhaustion and resignation. What else could there be? According to this, Lucy continued, the true owner of most of the company's shares is Emily. This new revelation fell like a bomb in the room. Alexander collapsed into the nearest armchair, overwhelmed by all the information. How is this possible? Richard asked, speaking for the first time since the revelations began. Emily took a step forward. When I left Alexander, I was devastated. My father, wanting to protect me, secretly bought a large number of shares in Morgan Enterprises. On his deathbed, he left them to me, with the condition that I wouldn't claim them unless it was absolutely necessary. Alexander looked at her, a mixture of betrayal and understanding in there. His eyes, why didn't you tell me before? Because I saw you happy, Alexander, Emily replied. I saw how you had built your life, how you loved. Samuel. I didn't want to destroy that. Samuel, who had been processing all this information, suddenly stood up. I need some air, he said. Before rushing out of the room, Alexander made a move to follow him, but Emily stopped him. Let him go. He needs time to assimilate all of this. Silence fell over the room again, each person lost in their own thoughts and emotions. It was Sarah who finally broke the silence. Mr. Morgan, she said softly, what's going to happen now? Alexander looked around at the people who had been part of his life for so many years. Each of them held a secret. Each had played a role in this complicated web of lies and hidden truths. Now, he said finally, we're going to face the truth. All of us. And then we'll decide what to do with the time we have left. As he said these words, Alexander felt a sharp pain in his chest. He brought a hand to his heart, his face contorting in pain. Alexander, Emily cried, running towards him. "I'm fine," he managed to say. But his pallor said otherwise. "Call an ambulance," Richard ordered, while helping Alexander to sit down. As chaos broke out in the mansion, with Sarah frantically calling emergency services and Emily holding Alexander's hand, no one noticed a figure observing everything from the shadows of the garden. Samuel, with tears in his eyes, watched as his father. No, the man who had raised him as a father was taken out on a stretcher. At that moment, he made a decision that would change the course of the Morgan family's history forever. As the ambulance drove away, sirens wailing into the night, the inhabitants of the Morgan mansion looked at each other, aware that nothing would ever be the same. The truths had come to light, but the consequences of these revelations were just beginning to unfold. And so, with Alexander fighting for his life in an ambulance, Emily facing her past, Samuel disappeared into the night, and the others trying to process everything that had happened. The second chapter of our story comes to an end, leaving more questions than answers, and setting the stage for the dramatic events that are to come. Dawn found the Morgan mansion immersed in a tense silence. The events of the previous night had left all the inhabitants in a state of shock and bewilderment. In the waiting room of Central Hospital, Emily and Richard awaited news about Alexander's condition, while Sarah had stayed at the mansion, waiting for Samuel's return. The sound of hurried footsteps made Emily and Richard look up. A tired-looking doctor was approaching them. "Family of Mr. Morgan?" he asked. Emily jumped to her feet. "Yes, doctor. How is Alexander?" The doctor looked at them gravely. "Mr. Morgan has suffered a severe heart attack. We've managed to stabilize him, but his condition is critical. The next 48 hours will be crucial." Richard put a hand on Emily's shoulder, who seemed about to collapse. "Can we see him?" he asked. "At the moment he's in intensive care. You'll be able to see him briefly in a few hours," the doctor replied before leaving Emily collapsed into the chair, her eyes full of unshed tears. "This is all my fault," she murmured. "If I hadn't kept so many secrets." Richard looked at her with compassion. "Emily, we've all made mistakes. The important thing now is to stay united for Alexander and for Samuel." At the mention of Samuel's name, they exchanged a look of concern. The young man had disappeared the night before, and no one knew his whereabouts. Meanwhile, in a modest hotel on the outskirts of the city, Samuel looked out the window, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions and thoughts. He had spent the night walking aimlessly through the streets, trying to process everything he had discovered. His phone, which he had kept turned off, lay on the bed. With a sigh, he decided to turn it on immediately. An avalanche of messages and missed calls flooded the screen. Most were from Sarah, but there was one from an unknown number that caught his attention. With trembling hands, he opened the message. "Samuel, I know you're confused and hurt, but there are things you need to know, things that weren't said last night. Please meet me at the Park Cafe at 2 p.m. Lucy." Samuel looked at the time. 1:30 p.m. After a sigh, moment of hesitation, he made a decision. It was time to face the truth, the whole truth. At the Morgan mansion, Sarah nervously paced the hallways. Suddenly, the doorbell startled her. Upon opening, she found herself face to face with Lucy. "What are you doing here?" Sarah asked, her tone a mixture of surprise and wariness. Lucy looked at her with determination. "I've come to talk to you, Sarah. There are things you need to know. Things that could change everything." Sarah hesitated for a moment, but finally stepped aside to let her in. "All right, but make it quick. I'm waiting for news from the hospital." As Sarah and Lucy locked themselves in the study to talk, at the hospital, Emily had managed to convince the nurses to let her see Alexander. Even if only for a few minutes, she entered the intensive care room with her heart in her throat. Alexander lay motionless, connected to several machines that monitored his vital signs. Emily approached and gently took his hand. "Oh, Alexander," she whispered, tears flowing freely down her cheeks. I'm so sorry I hid the truth from you all these years. I'm sorry I wasn't braver, more honest." She paused, trying to control her voice. "Please, you have to recover. Samuel needs you. I need you." At that moment, she felt a slight squeeze on her hand. Alexander's eyes opened slowly, focusing on her with difficulty. "Emily," he murmured hoarsely. "Alexander," she exclaimed, immediately calling for the nurse. As the doctors rushed in to examine Alexander, Emily was ushered out of the room. In the hallway, she ran into Richard. "He's awake," she said, a mixture of relief and anxiety in her voice. Richard hugged her, sharing her relief, but their moment of joy was interrupted by the sound of his phone. Seeing the name on the screen, his expression changed. "It's from the bank," he said, moving away to answer. Meanwhile, at the Park Cafe, Samuel nervously awaited Lucy's arrival. When he saw her approach, he felt a mixture of anticipation and fear. "Thank you for coming," Lucy said, sitting across from him. Samuel looked at her intently. "What did you have to tell me?" Lucy took a deep breath before speaking. "Samuel, there's something that wasn't revealed last night. Something about your real father." The young man felt the world stop. "What do you mean? Isn't Alexander?" "No," Lucy interrupted. "Alexander is your biological father. But there's more to this story than you think." As Lucy began to reveal the whole truth at the Morgan mansion, Sarah listened with growing astonishment to the words of the other Lucy. "So, all this time..." Sarah, hermit, trying to process the information. Lucy nodded. "Yes, I've been working in secret to uncover the truth. But there's more. Sarah, much more." At the hospital, Richard returned with a pale face. "Emily, we have a problem. A big problem." "What's going on?" she asked, fearing the answer. "Someone has emptied the company's accounts. All the money has disappeared." The news fell like a bomb. At that moment, the doctor came out of Alexander's room. "Ma'am," he said, addressing Emily, "Mr. Morgan is asking for his son. He says it's urgent, that he has something important to tell him." Emily and Richard exchanged worried looks. Samuel was still missing. The company's accounts had been emptied, and Alexander, still in critical condition, insisted on speaking with his son. Meanwhile, at the Park Cafe, Samuel listened with growing horror to Lucy's revelations. Each word was like a dagger, tearing the already fragile fabric of his reality. "It can't be," he murmured, his mind struggling to process the information. "All this time..." Lucy looked at him with compassion. "I know it's hard to believe, Samuel, but I have proof." She took an envelope from her bag and placed it on the table. "Everything is here." With trembling hands, Samuel opened the envelope and began to read the documents. His face went from disbelief to shock, and then to deep sadness. "Why are you telling me all this now?" he finally asked, looking up at Lucy. She took a breath before answering. "Because your father is in the hospital, Samuel. And because I think you deserve to know the truth before making any decisions about your future." At that moment, Samuel's phone rang. It was Emily. "Samuel, please, you need to come to the hospital," Emily said, her voice filled with urgency. "Your father Alexander is asking for you. He says he has something important to tell you." Samuel looked at the documents on the table, and then at Lucy. "I'm on my way," he finally said, hanging up the phone. As he got up to leave, Lucy grabbed his arm. "Samuel, there's something else you should know before you go." At the Morgan mansion, Sarah finished listening to the other Lucy's revelations. Her world, like Samuel's had been, turned upside down. "So what do we do now?" Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper. Lucy looked at her with determination. "Now, we go to the hospital. It's time for the whole truth to come out." As Sarah and Lucy headed to the hospital, Richard received another alarming call. This time it was from the police department. "Mr. Foster," said the voice on the other end of the line, "we've received concerning information about Morgan Enterprises. We need you to come to the station immediately to answer some questions." Richard felt the ground opening beneath his feet. What else could go wrong? At the hospital, Alexander struggled to stay conscious. He knew he had little time left and needed to see Samuel. There were so many things to say, so many secrets to reveal. As the city bustled with activity, oblivious to the drama unfolding, the protagonists of our story converged on the hospital Samuel. With the weight of new revelations on his shoulders, Emily, torn between her concern for Alexander and fear of the consequences of her past actions, Richard, facing a police investigation, Sarah and Lucy, bearers of truths that could change everything. And at the center of it all, Alexander Morgan, fighting not only for his life, but for the opportunity to redeem himself, to correct the mistakes of the past. Before it was too late, the elevator opened, and Samuel stepped out, his face a mask of determination. At the same time, Sarah and Lucy appeared from the stairs, and through the main door, Richard entered, his phone ringing incessantly. Emily, who was waiting in the hallway, saw how everyone converged towards her. At that moment, she knew that the hour of truth had arrived. There was no turning back. The door to Alexander's room opened, and the doctor came out with a grave expression. "Family of Mr. Morgan," he said, looking at all of them, "I'm afraid his condition has worsened. If you have anything to say to him, this might be the moment." The silence that followed was deafening. Each of those present carried with them a piece of the puzzle, a truth that could change the fate of everyone. And now, faced with the possibility of losing Alexander forever, they had to decide: reveal the truth and risk everything, or take their secrets to the grave. Samuel stepped forward, his hand clutching the documents Lucy had given him. "I need to see my father," he said, his voice firm despite the turmoil of emotions inside him. "Alone." As Samuel entered the room, the others looked at each other, aware that what happened in the next few minutes would change their lives forever. The door closed behind Samuel, leaving the group in a silence loaded with tension. Emily turned to Lucy, her eyes full of questions. Richard, for his part, nervously looked at his phone, knowing that at any moment he could receive the call that would take him to the police station. Inside the room, Samuel slowly approached the bed where Alexander lay. The man he had believed to be his father all his life seemed smaller and more fragile, connected to all those machines. "Dad," Samuel said softly, taking Alexander's hand. Alexander's eyes opened slowly, focusing on his son. A weak smile formed on his lips. "Samuel," he murmured. "You've come." "I'm here, Dad," Samuel replied, struggling to hold back tears. There's so much I need to tell you." Alexander weakly squeezed Samuel's hand. "And you, son. But first you need to know the truth. The whole truth." Samuel felt a lump in his throat. "The truth about what, Dad?" Alexander took a deep breath, gathering his last strength. "About your mother, about the company, about us." Samuel felt a knot in his throat. "What truth, Dad?" Alexander took a deep breath, gathering his last strength. "About your mother, about the company, about us." While Alexander began to speak, revealing long-held secrets outside the room, the drama continued to unfold. Emily, unable to contain her anxiety, approached Lucy. "What did Hugh tell Samuel? What does he know that I don't?" Lucy looked at her with a mixture of compassion and determination. "Emily, there are things about the past, about your relationship with Alexander, that not even you know." Before Emily could respond, Richard's phone rang. Everyone looked at him as he listened in silence, his face growing paler by the moment. "I understand," he finally said, hanging up. He turned to the others, his expression somber. "The police are on their way. It seems someone has presented evidence of financial irregularities in Morgan Enterprises." The shock was evident on everyone's faces. Sarah, who had remained silent until now, stepped forward. "I think it's time everyone knew the truth," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Lucy and I have discovered something that changes everything." Meanwhile, inside the room, Alexander continued his confession to Samuel. "Son," Alexander said, his voice barely a whisper, "when I met Emily, we were young and in love. But my father, he had other plans for me and for the company." Samuel listened in silence, his eyes fixed on Alexander's face. "He forced me to marry my business partner's daughter," Alexander continued. "Emily disappeared and I thought she had abandoned me. It wasn't until years later that I discovered she was pregnant when she left." "But that's not all, is it?" Samuel asked, remembering Lucy's revelations. Alexander closed his eyes for a moment, as if gathering strength. "No, it's not. The truth is that your adoption wasn't what we made you believe. Emily gave you up for adoption to protect you. and I orchestrated everything to adopt you without anyone knowing the truth." Samuel felt the world spinning around him. Why? Why keep everything a secret? "For the company," Alexander replied, his voice laden with regret. "My father threatened to disinherit me if I acknowledged a child out of wedlock, and I was too cowardly to face him." Outside the room, the tension was palpable. Emily looked at Lucy and Sarah, waiting for explanations. "What have you discovered?" she asked, her voice trembling. Lucy took a folder out of her bag. "We've been investigating for months. The truth is that Morgan Enterprises, it's not what everyone believes." Richard, who had been listening attentively, approached. "What do you mean?" "The company was founded with money of dubious origin," Sarah explained. "Alexander's father was involved in illegal activities." The revelation fell like a bomb. Emily brought a hand to her mouth, horrified. "But that means... It means that the entire Morgan fortune could be confiscated," Richard completed, suddenly understanding why the police were involved. At that moment, a commotion was heard in the hallway. Several police officers were approaching, led by a serious-looking detective. "Richard Foster?" the detective asked. Richard nodded, resigned. "That's me." "You're under arrest on suspicion of financial fraud and money laundering," said the detective, as one of the officers handcuffed him. Inside the room, oblivious to the chaos unfolding outside, Alexander and Samuel continued their conversation. "Son," Alexander said, his voice growing weaker, "I need you to forgive me. I've made so many mistakes." Samuel, with tears in his eyes, squeezed his father's hand. "Dad, I've lied to you too about my condition, about..." But before he could finish, the machines connected to Alexander began to sound alarmingly. Samuel jumped up, shouting for help. Doctors and nurses rushed into the room, pushing Samuel outside. In the hallway, he found himself in the midst of chaos. Richard being handcuffed, Emily crying, Lucy and Sarah trying to explain something to the police. "What's going on?" Samuel shouted, his world crumbling around him. Emily approached him, hugging him tightly. "Oh, Samuel," she sobbed, "everything has fallen apart." At that moment, the doctor came out of Alexander's room, his face somber. Everyone turned to him, holding their breath. "I'm sorry," said the doctor. "We've done everything possible, but..." The words hung in the air, but their meaning was clear. Alexander Morgan, the man who had been the center of their lives, was gone. The silence that followed was deafening. Samuel collapsed to the floor, overwhelmed by pain and guilt. Emily cried silently, leaning against the wall. Richard, still handcuffed, lowered his head in respect. Lucy and Sarah exchanged glances, aware that now more than ever, the full truth needed to come to light. "Detective," Lucy said, approaching the officer who had arrested Richard. "There's something you need to know. Something that changes everything you think you know about the Morgan family and their company." The detective looked at her curiously. "What are you talking about?" Lucy took a deep breath before continuing. "The truth is that Alexander Morgan wasn't the real owner of the company. It was all an elaborate facade to hide the true identity of the owner." Everyone present, including Richard, looked at Lucy in amazement. What other secrets did the Morgan family hold? "The real owner," Lucy continued, "is someone who has been operating from the shadows for years. Someone we all know, but no one suspected." "Who?" Emily asked, her voice barely a whisper. Lucy looked at Sarah, who nodded in support. Then, turning to the group, she pronounced a name no one expected. "The true owner and mastermind behind everything is Sarah." The revelation fell like lightning on a clear day. All eyes turned to Sarah, who remained impassive in the face of the looks of astonishment and confusion. "It's true," Sarah said, her voice firm despite the tension of the moment. "I am the true owner of Morgan Enterprises, and it's time everyone knew the whole truth." As Sarah began to unravel the complex web of lies and secrets that had surrounded the Morgan family for decades, in the adjacent room, doctors were fighting to revive Alexander. Suddenly, against all odds, the machines began to stabilize. The chief doctor rushed out into the hallway. "It's a miracle," he exclaimed. "Mr. Morgan, he's back." The news interrupted Sarah's confession. For a moment, everyone was paralyzed, unable to process this new turn of events. Samuel was the first to react, running towards his father's room. Emily followed closely behind, a mixture of relief and anxiety on her face. The detective, still trying to assimilate Sarah's revelations, turned to her. "Ma'am, I think we'll have to continue this conversation at the police station. All of you," he said, looking at the group, "will have to accompany us to give statements." As the officers began to organize the transfer, inside Alexander's room, a moving scene was unfolding. Alexander, weak but conscious, looked at Samuel and Emily with eyes full of tears. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm sorry for everything." Samuel took his father's hand, his face a mixture of conflicting emotions. "Dad, there's so much we need to talk about, and we will," Emily interrupted, her voice soft but firm. "But now, Alexander needs to rest, and we have to face the consequences of our actions." Outside the room, Sarah, Lucy, and Richard were being escorted by the officers. Each of them carried with them a piece of the puzzle, a part of the truth that, once revealed, would forever change the fate of the Morgan family and everyone involved. As the group was led out of the hospital, the sun was beginning to set on the horizon, tinting the sky in shades of red and gold. It was the end of a day that had seen more drama and revelations than anyone could have imagined, but it was also the beginning of a new era for the Morgans, an era of uncomfortable truths, difficult redemptions, and perhaps second chances. The city continued with its frantic rhythm, oblivious to the drama that had unfolded in the hospital. But for the protagonists of our story, nothing would ever be the same. The lies had been exposed, the secrets revealed, and now faced with the consequences of their actions, each of them would have to decide which path to take. Could Samuel and Alexander rebuild their relationship on foundations of truth? Would Emily manage to redeem herself in her son's eyes? What would be the fate of Morgan Enterprises under Sarah's true direction? And, perhaps most importantly, could all of them find the forgiveness and redemption they so desperately sought? As the police patrol drove away from the hospital, carrying Sarah, Lucy, and Richard, and Samuel and Emily remained by Alexander's bedside, one thing was clear. The saga of the Morgans was far from over. In fact, in many ways, it was just beginning. And so, with more questions than answers, with wounded but hopeful hearts, and with an uncertain future ahead, the third chapter of our story comes to an end, leaving readers eager to discover what twists and surprises fate has in store for the Morgans in the chapters to come. The interrogation room of the Central Police Station buzzed with unusual activity. In separate rooms, Sarah, Lucy, and Richard waited to be interrogated, each immersed in their own thoughts, and concerned Sarah, sitting with her back straight and her face impassive, mentally reviewed the events that had led her to this moment. Decades of secrets and manipulations were about to come to light, and she knew the consequences would be monumental. In another room, Lucy nervously played with the edge of her blouse, wondering if she had done the right thing by revealing the truth. Her loyalty to Samuel had been the driving force behind her actions, but now, faced with the reality of a police investigation, doubts began to assail her. Richard, for his part, remained silent, his mind working at full speed to find a way out of this situation. As Alexander's right-hand man for so many years, he knew that his knowledge of the company's operations put him in a delicate position. Meanwhile, at the hospital, Alexander Morgan struggled to stay conscious. Samuel and Emily remained by his side, their faces reflecting a mixture of relief at his recovery and anxiety about the uncertain future that awaited them. "Dad," Samuel said softly, "the doctors say you need to rest, but there's so much we need to talk about." Alexander tried to smile, though the gesture turned into a grimace of pain. "I know, son, and we will. But first, I need you to understand something. Everything I did for you and for the family." Emily, who had remained silent until now, stepped forward. "Alexander, I think it's time Samuel knew the whole truth about his birth, about the company, about everything. Alexander nodded weakly. "You're right, Emily, no more secrets, no more lies." And so, in that hospital room with the rhythmic sound of machines in the background, Alexander and Emily began to unravel the complex web of truths and lies that had defined their lives. For so many years, Samuel listened in silence, his mind struggling to process each new revelation. The truth about his birth, Sarah's role in the company, grandfather Morgan's manipulations. Each piece of the puzzle that was revealed only seemed to complicate the picture further. Meanwhile, at the police station, the detective in charge of the case, Jack Soto, was preparing to begin the interrogations. With years of experience in corporate fraud cases, Soto knew this case was different. The implications went beyond simple financial crimes. Here was a story of decades of family deceptions and secrets. He decided to start with Sarah. He entered the interrogation room, his face a mask of professionalism. "Mrs. Sarah Parker," he began, sitting across from her, "I'm sure you understand the gravity of the situation you're in." Sarah nodded slightly. "I understand perfectly, Detective, and I'm willing to cooperate fully." Soto looked at her curiously. "Good. Then why don't we start at the beginning? How did you come to be the true owner of Morgan Enterprises?" Sarah took a deep breath before beginning her story. It all started more than 30 years ago, when Alexander's father, Mr. Ernest Morgan, hired me as his personal assistant. As Sarah revealed the intricate story of power, manipulation, and secrets that had defined the Morgan family for decades. At the hospital, Samuel struggled to assimilate his parents' revelations. "So," he finally said, his voice barely a whisper, "everything I thought I knew about our family, about the company, was it all a lie?" Alexander tried to sit up, but the pain forced him to lie back down. "Not everything, son. The love we feel for you, that was always real." Emily, with tears in her eyes, took Samuel's hand. "I know it's hard to understand, but everything we did was to protect you." Samuel abruptly withdrew his hand. "Protect me? By lying to me my whole life? By making me believe I was disabled?" "Samuel, please," Emily pleaded. "You have to understand the circumstances were complicated." "Complicated?" Samuel stood up, his voice shaking with contained anger. "You stole my life, my identity. All for what? For money? For the damn company?" Alexander tried to speak, but a coughing fit interrupted him. Emily rushed to his side, helping him drink some water. "Son," Alexander said, when he could speak, "I know you're angry and you have every right to be, but please let us explain everything." Samuel looked at his parents, two people who now seemed like strangers to him. "What else is there to explain? You lied to me. You made me live a lie." "The truth is more complex than you think," Emily intervened. "Your grandfather, Mr. Ernest, he—" But before Emily could continue, the door to the room burst open. Detective Soto entered, followed closely by two officers. "I'm sorry to interrupt," Soto said, his voice firm but not devoid of compassion, "but I need to speak with Mrs. Emily Morgan. And you, Mr. Morgan," he added, looking at Alexander. "As soon as the doctors authorize it, you'll also have to accompany us to give a statement." Emily looked at Alexander with concern before turning to Samuel. "Son, But Samuel had already turned away, unable to look his mother in the eye. "Go," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "You've said enough." With a heavy heart, Emily followed the detective out of the room, leaving Samuel alone with Alexander. The silence that followed was deafening. Father and son, united by blood, but separated by years of lies, looked at each other, each struggling with their own inner demons. Meanwhile, at the police station, Sarah continued her story before an increasingly astonished Detective Soto. "Mr. Ernest wasn't the respectable businessman everyone believed," Sarah explained. "He had connections to organized crime, used the company to launder money. I discovered all this by accident." "And what did you do with that information?" Soto asked, leaning forward. With interest, Sarah smiled bitterly. "What any ambitious young woman would have done. I used it to negotiate. Mr. Ernest offered me a part of the company in exchange for my silence over time. That part became the majority. And Alexander Morgan, What did he know about all this? At first, nothing, Sarah replied. Mr. Ernest kept him in the dark, but when he fell ill, he asked me to protect Alexander, to guide him. And that's what I did in my own way. In another interrogation room, Lucy faced her own questions. The detective assigned to her, a middle-aged woman named Carmen Ruiz, looked at her with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. Miss Lucy Mendoza, Detective Ruiz began, you claim to have discovered the truth about the Morgan family during your time as Samuel's physiotherapist. How exactly did you come across that information? Lucy took a deep breath before answering. At first it was just suspicions. I noticed inconsistencies in Samuel's condition. Then, one day, I saw him. Walk when he thought no one was watching.
And why didn't you report this immediately? I fell in love with him, Lucy admitted, lowering her gaze. I wanted to protect him, but the more I investigated, the more I realized that Samuel was also a victim in all of this. As the interrogations continued at the police station at the hospital, Samuel finally broke the silence. All those therapies, all those years pretending, why, Dad? Why did you make me live that lie? Alexander closed his eyes, the weight of his past decisions crushing him. At first, it was for your safety. Your grandfather, he had dangerous enemies. We believed that if we kept you out of the public eye, you'd be safe. And after, when grandfather died? After. Alexander paused, struggling to find the right words. After, it was fear. Fear of losing everything we had built. Fear that the truth would drive you away from us. Samuel laughed bitterly. Well, it seems that fear became reality anyway. At that moment, Samuel's phone vibrated. It was a message from Lucy. I'm sorry for everything, we need to talk. It's important. Samuel looked at the message, then at his father. His whole life had been an elaborate lie, and now, when he finally believed he was close to the truth, he felt there were more secrets to uncover. I have to go, he said, heading for the door. Samuel, please, Alexander called, his voice broken with emotion. Don't make the same mistakes I did. Don't let pride and fear drive you away from the people who love you. Samuel stopped at the door without turning around. Love, I don't know if I ever knew the true meaning of that word in this family. And with that, he left the room, leaving Alexander alone with his remorse and the constant beeping of the machines. As Samuel headed towards the police station, determined to uncover the whole truth, in Detective Soto's office, a new piece of information threatened to change the entire landscape of the case. Sir, a young officer said, rushing into the office. We've received information from Interpol. It seems there's an international connection in this case. Someone has been moving large amounts of money out of the country. Soto frowned, taking the report the officer offered him. As he read, his eyes widened in surprise. This changes everything, he muttered. Call everyone involved. We need a face-to-face confrontation. It's time for all the truth to come to light. As night fell over the city, the protagonists of our story prepared for a confrontation that promised to change their lives forever. Long-held secrets were about to be revealed, loyalties would be tested, and the true meaning of family and love would be questioned. In the conference room of the police station, Soto prepared the stage for what he knew would be an explosive meeting. Sarah, Lucy, Richard, Emily, and soon Samuel would all be face-to-face, forced to confront the consequences of years of lies and manipulations. And in his hospital room, Alexander Morgan looked out the window towards the city that had witnessed the rise and fall of his empire. With renewed determination, he began to disconnect the wires and tubes that kept him in bed. He had made too many mistakes in his life, but he was determined not to make one more. It was time to face the truth, regardless of the consequences. The stage was set, the pieces in place. And as the city continued with its nightly routine, oblivious to the drama unfolding in its midst, the Morgans and all those involved in their story prepared for. Cue, the door burst open. Samuel entered, his face a mask of contained emotions. Behind him, to everyone's surprise, appeared Alexander Morgan, pale and visibly weak, but with determination burning in his eyes. Alexander!
Emily exclaimed, jumping to her feet. "What are you doing here? You should be in the hospital." Alexander raised a hand, silencing her. "I've spent too much time hiding from the truth, Emily. It's time to face the consequences of our actions." Detective Soto, after a moment of surprise, nodded. "Very well. Now that we're all here, let's begin, Sarah Parker. Why don't you tell us the true story of Morgan Enterprises?" Sarah straightened in her seat, her gaze sweeping over the faces around her. "It all started 30 years ago," she began, her voice firm but laden with emotion. "Mr. Ernest Morgan, Alexander's father, hired me as his personal assistant. Soon discovered that the company was a front for illicit activities. A murmur of surprise ran through the room. Alexander closed his eyes, as if the weight of this revelation was too much to bear. Sarah continued. "Mr. Ernest offered me a part of the company in exchange for my silence over time. That part grew until I became the majority shareholder. When Mr. Ernest fell ill, he asked me to protect Alexander and guide the company." "And how does Samuel's adoption fit into all of this?" Soto asked, turning to Emily and Alexander. Emily, with tears in her eyes, took the floor. "When I discovered I was pregnant, Alexander was already engaged to another woman. His father, Mr. Ernest, threatened to disinherit him if he acknowledged a child out of wedlock. I gave Samuel up for adoption to protect him. Samuel, who had remained silent until now, stood up abruptly. Protect me, by making me believe I was adopted, by lying to me about my physical condition." "Son, please," Alexander intervened, his voice broken with emotion. "I know we failed you, but everything we did was out of love." "Love?" Samuel spat. "Do you call living a lie love? Stealing my identity, my life?" Detective Soto raised a hand, calling for calm. "Mr. Morgan, according to our investigations, you orchestrated Samuel's adoption without anyone knowing the truth. Is this correct?" Alexander nodded slowly. "Yes. When I discovered that Emily had given our son up for adoption, I moved heaven and earth to find him. I arranged everything to adopt him legally, but I kept the truth secret. I feared that if the truth came to light, I would lose everything. The company, my position, my son. And I helped maintain that lie," Sarah added. "I saw how Alexander suffered, torn between his love for Samuel and the weight of his father's expectations. I thought I was protecting the family, but now I see that I only perpetuated the cycle of lies." Lucy, who had remained silent until now, cleared her throat. I discovered the truth by accident. I saw Samuel walk when he thought no one was watching. I started investigating, and I fell in love with him in the process." Samuel looked at her, a mixture of pain and betrayal in his eyes. "You too, Lucy. How long did you know without telling me?" "I'm sorry, Samuel," Lucy sobbed. "I wanted to protect you. I thought that if you discovered the truth all at once, it would destroy you." Detective Soto spoke again. "There's something else you all need to know. We've received information from Interpol. It appears that someone has been moving large amounts of money out of the country. Money that, according to our investigations, comes from the illicit activities initiated by Mr. Ernest Morgan." All eyes turned to Richard, who had remained silent until now. "Richard," Alexander said, disbelief tinging his voice. "You?" Richard looked up, his face a mask of guilt and determination. "I'm sorry, Alexander. When I discovered the truth about the origin of the company's money, I panicked. I thought that if I could hide a part, I could protect us all if the truth came out." The silence that followed was deafening. Each person in the room was absorbed in their own thoughts, processing the revelations and their implications. Finally, it was Samuel who broke the silence. "All my life," he began, his voice shaking with emotion, "I've lived surrounded by lies. Every person in this room, every person who said they loved me, has lied to me in one way or another." He paused, looking at each of those present. "But the worst of all is that I also lied to myself. I hid behind a fictitious disability because I was afraid to face the world, to not live up to expectations." Alexander tried to approach his son, but Samuel raised a hand, stopping him. "No, Dad. Please let me finish. I've spent the last few hours thinking, remembering every moment of my life in this new light. And I've realized something. Despite the lies, despite the deception, the love I felt that I feel for all of you is real." Emily sobbed softly, while Alexander struggled to contain his own tears. "I can't say I forgive you, not now," Samuel continued, "but I'm willing to try to understand, to try to rebuild our family on foundations of truth this time." Detective Soto nodded gravely. "Mr. Morgan Samuel, your willingness for reconciliation is admirable. However, I must inform you that this doesn't change the legal situation. There are serious crimes that must be answered for." Sarah stood up. "Detective, I take full responsibility for the company's illegal activities. It was I who allowed them to continue, who covered them up all these years." "No, Sarah," Alexander interrupted. "I can't allow you to bear this burden alone. I'm responsible too. I knew, or at least suspected, about the origin of my father's money. I chose to look the other way." Richard also stood up. "And I'm guilty of embezzlement and attempting to conceal evidence. I'm willing to fully cooperate with the investigation." Detective Soto looked at each of them, nodding slowly. "Your cooperation will be taken into account. However, you must understand that there will be legal consequences." As the detective began to detail the next steps of the legal process, Samuel approached Lucy. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I never meant to hurt you." Samuel gently took her hand. "I know we all made mistakes, but maybe from all of this, we can build something new, something honest." At the other end of the room, Emily and Alexander shared a look loaded with regret and hope. "Do you think he'll ever be able to forgive us?" Emily asked quietly. Alexander took her hand. "I don't know, but for the first time in a long time, I have hope." As the meeting came to an end and the officers began to process those involved, a sense of change filled the air. The truth, as painful as it was, had finally come to light, and with it, the possibility of redemption and a new beginning. Weeks later, in a courtroom, sentences were being read. Alexander and Sarah received prison sentences. Although with the possibility of parole for their cooperation, Richard would face a lesser sentence, but would have to return all the embezzled money. Emily, although not facing criminal charges, would have to perform community service. Samuel, sitting in the gallery, listened to everything with a mixture of emotions. Beside him, Lucy squeezed his hand in support. When the session ended and the guards were taking away the convicted, Samuel approached his parents. "I'll visit you," he said, his voice laden with emotion. "We have a lot to talk about, a lot to rebuild." Alexander and Emily, with tears in their eyes, nodded gratefully. For the first time in decades, they felt a weight lifting from their shoulders. The truth, as painful as it was, had freed them. As Samuel left the courthouse, with Lucy by his side, he looked up at the clear sky. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in his life, he felt truly free. Free to be himself, free to love, free to live